Welcome everybody, welcome to Policy Exchange and to the next event in our ongoing series on safer smartphones. This one is called Where Next for Government, Parents and Schools. First, particularly for this event, if I could ask everyone to make sure their phones are on silent and not disturbing their attention. As I mentioned, Policy Exchange has been pursuing this area of interest for over a year now. We had an event a year ago with Professor Jonathan Haidt talking about the launch of his book, The Anxious Generation. And at the same time, we also published our report, Disconnect, which looked at schools with an effective smartphone ban and those without such a ban, and found a number of strong correlations, including that they were twice as likely to be rated outstanding by Ofsted, that their students achieved higher GCSE results as measured by Progress 8, including after you take into account the proportion of disadvantaged children at those schools and a range of other findings. In January, earlier this year, we held an event with MP Josh McAllister, who was at the time bringing forward his safer smartphone bill, and with a number of academics discussing the evidence for this. And with that bill now having sort of had its format changed considerably, we are holding this event talking about where next. We're delighted to have such a strong panel. We have Rosie Duffield, Member of Parliament for Canterbury, who's been one of Parliament's most active and dedicated campaigners on this issue. Rosie has been a fantastic friend to Policy Exchange over a number of years, including doing the foreword for one of our most successful ever reports, Asleep at the Wheel, 2 years ago, and we're really delighted to welcome her to the stage here to talk about another hugely important issue. We have Damian McBeath, Principal at the John Wallis Academy. I think so often when these things are discussed about smartphones in schools, we hear people on the radio, on the TV, saying, oh, but isn't it terribly hard, or what are the benefits of this? And obviously, it doesn't solve what they do at home. The last one's obviously true, but Damian has actually implemented an effective ban in his school, and he will be just actually talking about how you can do it and what the benefits are. Salma Shah, a former Special Advisor to the Home Secretary, who worked on the Online Safety Act as it was being devised and originated, and will give the real government insider's view as to what legislation can do, but perhaps even more importantly, what it can't do and what its limitations are. And then finally, Sophie Winkleman, actress and screen-free childhood campaigner, who has been a vigorous campaigner about smartphones, edtech and social media, for, again, being very vigorous in taking this argument forward to ordinary parents and people out there in the population. So without further ado, Rosie, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Iain, and thanks so much to Policy Exchange for inviting me here today to speak on an issue that I believe to be one of the most important currently, but which has only recently started to cut through. For the past couple of years, Sophie and I have been part of a cross-political group of parents, campaigners, head teachers, parliamentarians and lawyers who are increasingly concerned about the use of smartphones both in schools but also more generally by children and teenagers. We share evidence, research, ideas and opportunities to engage with the government and discuss policy. This has been surprisingly clunky and difficult, given the mounting evidence of harm and the growing level of concern from individual parents and groups of parents. We hear the horrific stories which make headlines and give a platform to individual parent campaigners such as Ian Russell, Molly's dad, Esther Jai, Brianna's mum, and our own Ellen Room, who's in our groups with us, Jules's mum. All have accounts of the direct link between social media and the devastating, untimely loss of their precious children. But we don't seem to be able to link those stories together as MPs, as a parliament, across political divides and actually do something. It's increasingly frustrating and increasingly urgent. How many more teenagers' names do we need to read? There's always a danger when trying to limit or restrict something that as MPs or activists we're accused of wanting to go back to the Middle Ages or put the genie back in the bottle, or that we're all censoring life a la Mary Whitehouse. But the things we enjoy or are addictive that can enhance our lives and connect us are also damaging and harming those that depend on us for guidance, boundaries and safeguards. A few years ago, I was inundated with correspondence from parents in Whitstable in my constituency because our beaches were littered with those tiny silver canisters containing laughing gas or nitrous oxide. Kids were able to buy a pack in local shops for around £5. I consulted experts and held an adjournment debate on what I'd learned about the potential risks to very young children's brains. In rare cases, it was fatal. All I wanted was to restrict sales to the extent that minors were unable to buy them with little or no ID check, and penalties on those who sell canisters to children were virtually unenforceable. I was trolled by the likes of Ash Sarkar, who called it a moral panic, and seemed to think it was hilarious to even consider restricting what she called the criminalisation of a substance which is far safer than alcohol. That may well be the case, but I'm not about to hand bottles of Kent cider to 10-year-olds in my constituency, and if that makes me the anti-fun MP, then so be it. Similarly, smartphones are of course not a killer of children in and of themselves, or adults, but the apps contained on them can lead to serious harm or even death if our children are left alone to navigate what Jonathan Haidt compares to sending them into space alone with no guidance or enough appropriate equipment. We are responsible. It's our duty to make sure that sites online that encourage harm, eating disorders, or even suicide are not left completely unchecked. My constituent Lucas was researching methods of suicide on sites such as Snapchat. His parents had no idea, but he had joined forums and there was some awareness at school as it had come up in jokey conversations. He died by suicide aged 16 after buying what he needed to online, having read how to carry out that action. He had a promising future and an incredibly loving family, and I think about Lucas every time I talk about this issue. And like so many parents I read about, his parents faced years of battling with phone companies, app admins, and like Ellen Room, who I mentioned earlier, parents simply need to understand what led to their children's untimely and hideous deaths. And those companies refuse point blank to release that information. Ellen has recently been in New York campaigning on this over the last week or so, and she's got lots of TV coverage. But there are so many more issues even than children's mental health, which is emerging in groups such as Health Professionals for Safer Screens, Safe Screens and others, who've done extensive research with schools in particular that I can't do justice to in this speech, but please do find out more about them online. Children need us to keep up the pressure on the government that growth, potentially lucrative from financial deals with tech firms, cannot be at the expense of our children. A generation who have already faced unprecedented pressures, rapid change, and the unregulated Wild West in their pockets without enough help or support from those of us in charge who are supposed to keep them safe. And just this weekend, MPs held advice surgeries every Friday in their constituencies, and you get a pattern of what people are coming to talk to you about. More and more and more parents and groups are coming to talk to me about this issue. I had an individual doctor, a paediatrician, who came to see me on Friday, and he'd allowed his 12-year-old son to come out of school and talk to me about it as well. And his son was really bright, really articulate. It was such a pleasure talking to him. But he was a kind of middle-class child, and he actually expressed the incredibly grown up and mature fears that people not like him, that weren't as advantaged, whose parents had to work longer hours, were going to feel even more pressure and just be sort of left alone with this tech. He wasn't being snotty or judgmental. He was just explaining the kinds of peer pressure that, even though he understands this issue very well and has talked to his parents about, he feels under, and they all feel under. He's 12, and he said he couldn't imagine life without those apps or his smartphone, even though he knew it was bad for him. And hearing that directly from children and groups such as Whitstable Unplugged in my constituency is what really gets you right there as an MP. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I don't know the best way to get in touch with government and make them do something. We know that Josh's bill was kind of effectively kicked into the long grass, which is incredibly disappointing because so many people had contributed and made it a really good start, I think, of the conversation and where we need to go. So I think all I could ask of anyone watching is to keep up the pressure, keep talking to your children's schools, keep talking to anyone you know who's in a group or connected with the government, and more importantly, let's encourage children like the kid that came to see me on Friday to speak about their own experiences and their own fears, because they need us desperately to do something to stop them being harmed. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk. My name's Damian McBeath. I'm the principal of the John Wallis Church of England Academy. We are a large school. Our youngest, it's not pupil, it's a child at 4 months old, and we go right up to 19-year-olds and children on their journey to university and the world beyond school. For years and years, the school had a phone ban. We'd had a phone ban pretty much for 10 years, except it wasn't a ban. What we were asking children to do was to turn their phones off, to leave it in the bottom of their bags, and to show some kind of superhuman power, to resist the urge to look at it when no one was looking, and to resist. So for years, since I became principal, I was reminding staff every single term. We were on repeat, like, we must uphold this policy. If you see a child with their phone out, make sure there's a sanction in place. And then the sanctions would get bigger. And in time, we kind of got to the point where we realized this just was not working. And what we've learned since is it wasn't just not working in our school, it's not working in most schools. If you look at Teacher Tap, 60% of teachers will report that they have seen a phone out in a school where there's supposed to be a ban. So we know that 90% of schools already have a ban. We know that most schools say they have a phone ban. Most teachers in those schools are saying they see children with their phones out. The children themselves are telling us. The survey through ParentKind, nearly a third of children were saying that their lessons in the last week have been disrupted by another child with their phone out. So we know these bans weren't working. And there was not one big moment, big dramatic incident in which we decided to go phone free. We'd seen a slow decline, an erosion of children's childhood, of conversation, of talk. We'd seen it for years, and in the end, we got to a point where we thought we had to act. So we put in place a new policy where children have to lock their phones in lockable pouches. So from bell to bell, from the moment they're inside our school, they cannot access their mobile phone. And that's the difference between the in your bag and something where the phones are locked away, where students cannot access them. Within 3 weeks of introducing the policy, we saw a notable change. Staff were talking about it, and we got in touch with Canterbury Christchurch University and said, we need to capture this. And they've been working with us over the last 18 months or so, doing research into the impact of it. So what did we find? Behaviour significantly improved. The amount of disruption inside lessons themselves was reduced significantly, and teachers spoke about this. They spoke about how well children could attend. They even changed the pedagogy of how they were teaching to make sure that they were keeping up with students. And it exists in the data. When we look at the number of detentions for disruptive incidents, 40% reduction in the number of detentions due to disruptive behaviour inside lessons. We also saw a significant decrease in the number of students who were truanting during the school day. 75% less truancy in the first 3 months since introducing the ban, and that has maintained since. Now, we've been looking into this more because this wasn't something that we had in mind when we set the policy up. And we've spoken to students, and what happened was that instead of going to their geography lessons, the odd student would sneak into the bathroom where they could be unsupervised. They'd get their phones out of their bag, usually, and they'd watch the next episode of whatever it was they were watching on Netflix, which just happened to be about 50 minutes, the same length as a geography lesson. So we've seen a big decrease in truancy. We've also seen our attendance increase, a 3% increase at this point last year. Our attendance is going up. And perhaps the most significant of all, 80% of online incidents of bullying of abuse. Usually incidents that take place out of school, we've seen an 80% reduction in the number of those incidents. Now, when we saw this, we were concerned that this might be something that children just weren't reporting. Was it still happening, and because we were a phone-free school now, they didn't report it? And the students themselves told us something really interesting. They said that these incidents never start out as bullying or abusive. It's usually kind of whipped up. There's usually a conversation that goes on for days. It gets worse and worse and worse until it gets to the point where someone says something so offensive and so abusive that it then gets reported as a safeguarding incident. What they say happens now, they talk to each other more. They have those discussions in school, so it doesn't kind of whip itself up into this really kind of horrible vortex online. But more than the data, it was the soft things that teachers reported that was really interesting. Teachers said that children were politer. They were opening doors more. Their relationships with each other were improving. They reported that inside a school, there was a much louder restaurant area because children were talking more. We saw children playing games like Uno. We have seen chess come back into the school restaurants. Lots of really interesting things happened. There are two stories that I'd like to share with you that really come to mind. I could tell you lots all afternoon. I'm a head teacher. We like to talk. One is I was in the school restaurant and we were talking about the impact of the ban with Visitor. We've had 50 heads of other schools in our schools since introducing the ban to share what we're doing. And there was a sudden rush towards the windows at this lunchtime. And as head teacher, that means your instincts kick in. So I was straight outside to see what was happening. And it had started to snow. And outside, in the playground, there were children outside with their mouths open, catching the snow in their mouths. Just being children, having fun outside in the snow. What struck me, though, 12 months ago, we wouldn't have seen that. 12 months ago, the children would have got their phones out. They would have been recording the snow instead of playing in it. But what we saw was they were being children. They were playing and catching it in their mouths as children do. The second one was an incident that happened earlier this year during our Year 11's mock exams. They had a little bit of free time afterwards and they had found, mischievously, they had discovered a fairy liquid bottle. And in a communal area decided to squirt the fairy liquid bottle on the floor and engage in a game of slip and slide. Not the best of choices to make, and we have since had a conversation about slip and slide and why it's not a good thing to do inside school. But when we look back and when we were looking into the incident, not a single child had their phone out. These were children being children, learning where the boundaries are and stepping over those boundaries on this occasion, but doing so in a really safe environment. It meant I could have a conversation as head teacher with those students. We could address the issue of slip and slide inside school, not a great idea. And then we could move on. 12 months ago, that would have been published online. I would have had parents phoning the office wondering why children were playing slip and slide. Some of these children would have the incidents recorded and reported and then published for everyone to see. It had changed the system. While I have a moment, I would like to pay tribute today to an incredible person who's been working with us at the school, who sadly passed away last weekend at Easter. Professor Lynn Revell from Canterbury Christchurch University has been working with the Academy since we started the ban 18 months ago. And she has been working with the teachers, doing a series of focus groups about the impact of what they are seeing. She's supported all the things around behaviour and everything we've seen there. But in the work that she was working on, and will come out in a report later this year, she discovered something else, that teachers were reporting the impact on their well-being changed significantly since we introduced the policy. They didn't say their well-being had improved. They said things like they felt like the leadership were supporting them. They felt their relationships with students had improved. They felt that they could have an authentic conversation with a student without the fear that that conversation would be recorded or posted or shared online. One of the teachers, when talking about this, gave a really interesting insight. They said they felt like time had slowed down since we introduced the policy. And when asked to explain that further, they described an incident where a child would come into the classroom. They might make a mistake and they receive a sanction. after giving out the sanction, what would happen in the past was that child would secretly send a text message to their parent. Their parent would be furious and send an email to the teacher. Before the lesson has even finished, the teacher's now got complaints from the parents. How dare you speak to my child? The leadership might get an email as well, and then the parent might decide to come to the school office, standing at the school door, demanding to know why their child's been given a detention in maths. Since we've had the ban in place, that doesn't happen now. The child has got time to reflect on what's happened. They could have a conversation with the teacher at the end of the lesson, and it feels like everything in the school day has slowed down. And that's why we're seeing the impact that we're seeing on teachers' well-being. That's why I am so passionate about what we're doing. There's lots and lots of people who've been writing and researching this far more than I have as a school. And some of the work that Sophie's been doing around screens and early years and other professionals, many of whom are in the room today, really made us stop and look about what's happening in our own early years. Because our early years teachers were reporting something in the playground, where the children at the end of the school day were running to go and see their parents, and their parents coming to collect them and weren't looking up from the devices. So you'd have a horrible incident where a child is coming to see their parents and the interaction. We've been looking at what we can do to support parents with this, to raise awareness. We've been having lots and lots of conversations. And I think the early years is where our focus is next, and that's where we're going to be looking for how we can develop things further. So for us as a school, we've seen the impact over 12 months of what being phone-free can do. We know there is a long way to go, that we need to support parents, we need to support children and their families. But I am absolutely passionate behind the need to support our teachers, the need to support our children, and I think that the way that we can do that is by implementing smartphone-free schools across the country. Thank you.
So in true SPAD style, ex-SPAD style, I've written all my notes on my smartphone, and so if this goes dead or goes black, then I'm going to be totally alone. So as Iain said, I was a former special advisor in the Home Office, and in 2017, myself and my Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, began a piece of work called the Online Harms White Paper, which became the Online Safety Act in 2023. Now, what we began with in the white paper in 2017 was precisely because of the stuff that you talked about, Rosie. It was those high-profile cases that were extreme and where there was no redress for parents or law enforcement or any other authorities to try and consider how they would find out information about how these tragic events had occurred. And our position was simple in the way we started, around the question of regulation, because there was always going to be some kind of business backlash from it. And it was simply this: if you create harm that impacts the state and state's resources, then you should be liable to pay for it. Oh, somebody using ChatGPT there as well. And that was a starting principle against the question of intervening with business. And I think it's an important point to make, because as we progress through, now that we have the Ofcom codes, and as we progress through this debate, we are going to have to continually find that balance and that understanding between several stakeholder groups. Now, I'm not a tech skeptic, but I recognise that there are things that tech companies can do. So that is the sort of starting position for where the legislation and the white paper began. And as we progressed on that journey, we did get a lot of pushback from tech companies, and not all of their arguments were wrong. You know, they did have questions around privacy for their customers and users. They did have questions about them themselves having to become an arbitration authority for what is essentially a public square, and that's legitimate concerns, especially around issues of freedom of speech. But our specific concern at the time was around this question of harm. Now, from the Home Office's perspective, actually harm is pretty easy because it's what's already illegal. You don't transfer that online. From the Culture Department's perspective, that had to deal with other issues of harm and other elements of harm, being able to gauge, define in law and codify it, addressing those harms becomes a lot more difficult. And so putting that and creating that arbitration within a regulator, in this case Ofcom, is also sensitive, which is why we've had 2 years of a conversation with Ofcom in consultation with various people to come up with this code that contains, I think, 40 measures or 40 elements that tech companies now need to address. So legislation is complicated. Coming up with the legislation, putting forward the legislation, and now enforcing the legislation is complicated. And why is it important to note that? Because clearly there is still really strong sentiment here. There will be strong sentiment with grassroots campaigners, there will be really strong sentiments with parents, and something you just said, Rosie, is interesting. We do get the sort of most extreme cases, the most high-profile cases, and we can't make legislation off the back of the most extreme cases. We need to understand what is the whole gamut of the issue. And actually, it doesn't have to be extreme for it to be bad. The example that you just gave about parents not looking at their children, that's not something that legislation can change. That's something that actually individuals have to change, and cultural norms have to change. And that is something that we also need to consider in the round. So we have this legislation, we have this code. What are we going to do with that now? I, for one, having seen this legislation go through, and don't forget, this is 2017 we're going back to, so it's taken a long time to get to this point. I, for one, think that it's important that we allow that legislation and those codes to bed in. I think it's really important that we enforce this as best we can, especially with grassroots organisations and with parliamentarians, to ensure that when tech companies do behave badly, that the full force of the enforcement and the regulator is felt by them, to show that there are some teeth here, that it wasn't just an empty exercise. And I hope that we are not going to be pushed into a position for other economic reasons, like trade deals, for example, where any of their safety measures are watered down, or indeed no other safety measures are met. But again, having said that, it is important that we do allow the enforcement to take place. The other thing that I think is really interesting about what's been said is that can legislation solve everything? So a smartphone ban. We can have a smartphone ban in schools, but how does that impact us at home? If we're going to have a smartphone ban, is it just going to be for under 16s? Or given the nature of what smartphones can do to all of us in this room, do we extend a ban where adults can't use smartphones past 10 p.m? So there are these questions that we might need to ask ourselves, because if it causes harm to a 16-year-old, why wouldn't we ban it further down the line as well? Now, I'm not saying, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes I would actually quite like to have an adult smartphone ban so that I don't have to look at my emails and my text messages all the time. But I do think it's important that we consider what a ban can actually achieve that a cultural norm cannot, particularly when we have cultural norms around other harmful substances already. Take alcohol, for example, or cigarettes. So I would end just by saying that we have made huge strides, and you used a phrase, Rosie, the Wild West. I recognise that phrase. I recognise that phrase from campaigners, and I think back then in 2017, that was absolutely true, that there was a Wild West out there online with social media companies and with the regulation. But we've come a long way since then, and I think we need to acknowledge that. I think we need to allow that to embed, and I think we need to recalibrate where we want to be for our online safety going forward for the next decade, to understand, is it about grassroots campaigns? Is it about creating those cultural norms? And is it really about embedding what we've done thus far in order to make our online world safer? Thank you.
Good afternoon, lovely to be here. Very good to be here with Rosie, who is one of the titans on our group to try and get this stuff out of children's lives. And I thoroughly recommend a day trip to Damian School. It's a triumph, it's a beautiful thing. I went there a few weeks ago. I personally think, thank you for what you've just said, I think the impact of smartphones on children's mental and physical health is so immense and so multi-stranded that it's actually impossible to make them safe. They're designed by geniuses to be unputdownable, which is why the angle of regulatory bodies solely addressing the issue of harmful material is, I think, one to be reconsidered. Even if a child is only watching animal videos for 3 hours, they're still stationary, isolated, and passive. They're simply consuming content, open vessels for other people's garbage, often for hours at a time, not to mention pitiful prey to bad people pretending to be 9-year-old fellow animal fans. The physical consequences of this vice-like addiction range from eyesight damage, spinal damage, sleep disturbance, hormone disruption, obesity, and manifold neurological impairments, which include the decimation of the attention span, giving rise to various ADHD-like symptoms. And one current study is exploring the link between children's screen use and early onset dementia. And these are just some of the physical harms. The emotional and safeguarding harms are equally multiple. Anxiety, depression, self-harm, eating disorders, the enticement to radicalization, gang violence, terrorism, life-changingly violent porn. The list is far too long for my time slot. The police have now joined the growing number of major public bodies in Britain who believe that social media should be made illegal for under-16s. I don't know, and nor does Rosie and Damian, how many more teen suicides, murders, and hospital admissions it will take for the roar to become too loud to ignore. But the screen issue is a many-headed hydra, and I now don't think it makes sense to have the smartphone debate in isolation away from the internet-connected devices children are using more and more in schools. In other words, big tech and ed tech are closer relatives than one might have thought and need an equally bright torch shone on the two of them. With schools going so digital, from nurseries using YouTube Kids and Siri voice assistants, Atom Learning and Twinkle proliferating in primary schools, Century Tech and Google Classroom in senior schools, not to mention exam bodies like Pearson EdXL plotting to take every subject online by 2030, we have to question this contagion of school day screen use alongside smartphones. EdTech is a dangerous one because it appears to be such a good thing, such a progressive and positive force. Yet lift up the shiny chrome lid and in the main it's just an unproven and massively profitable business. I know this now because a few years ago I tried really hard as a parent to believe in EdTech just so I could have an easy life. I asked the teachers why it was better for my children to log into times tables rockstars rather than just write them down and recite them aloud. I asked why it was better to fill in an online comprehension about an online passage of The Secret Garden rather than just read the book throughout the term and handwrite responses. I asked why it was better to make instantly forgettable PowerPoints on the Amazon rainforest or Christopher Columbus rather than hand-make projects and posters. I asked why it was a good thing to be rewarded with exploding stars, parrots, cakes and balloons every time something very basic was achieved. Surely simply getting it right and a teacher's tick should be sufficient reward. But the poor teachers could not answer me. It snowballed as the children got older and I had to ask different questions. How Googling something could be classified as homework. Why the children kept being referred to Dr. Frost online maths lectures without having first learned the topic in class. How it could be a good thing to get back home at 5 p.m. and have to open up a bright, sleep-disrupting screen for their homework. The final question seems to have been a particularly justified one, as just recently Health Professionals for Safer Screens, a group of NHS clinicians, have decreed that 11 to 17-year-olds should not exceed more than 1 to 2 hours of screen time per day on any digital device doing anything. When the teachers setting the work on these platforms couldn't answer my why is this better than paper, book and pen question, it was clear that something bigger was going on. Was it the school board who inflicted this stuff on teachers, the Department for Education, are Microsoft and Google giving schools devices and platforms at a huge discount so the kids become lifelong customers? Is there a data arrangement in there? Are the decision makers being financially incentivized? The speech and language therapists I know in early years in particular are horrified by what screens are doing to toddlers in their care, yet they're being encouraged to infuse more and more tech into the school day. There are so many questions to be answered. Since writing about this topic a few years ago, I've had thousands of parents contacting me, their emails and texts ranging from, we fight screen time at home and then my 10-year-old gets 80% of her homework on an app. My bookworm son doesn't read anymore. My daughter keeps asking for the online games after the online homework. Or my trustworthy, ambitious child is just 2 clicks away from the entire world every time he does his homework. Just a little bit of research proved what parents have known instinctively all along. Learning this way is not a good thing, for three principal reasons: distraction, quality of learning, and privacy. Firstly, distraction. A child has an internet-enabled device in front of them in class. When I looked this up, I found a colossal and buzzing chat forum about which games are best classroom time wasters and how to use a VPN or mobile data to bypass school security to access them. I don't blame them. What child wouldn't play Crunker or Slither instead of tuning into their physics lesson? Children are meant to push against authority, as Damian says, and they should. But if we let them do it this easily during their daily education, we are grossly letting them down. Many schools' tech departments work overtime to block certain sites while the children work out how to find new ones, but what a waste of time and effort on both sides. Jonathan Haidt, author of The Anxious Generation, doesn't let his 23-year-old students have a device in his classes. He calls them distraction machines. So why are we expecting our 10, 12, 14-year-olds to manage? Michael Bloomberg joined the conversation a couple of weeks ago, citing a review of 2 decades of academic research showing that children using laptops are easily distracted and distracting to their peers. Secondly, what is the quality of learning actually taking place if the devices aren't being used to play games and watch Netflix? We now know from studies across the world that it is not a neutral process to transfer content from paper to a screen. John Jerem, a respected educational researcher, analysed the results of over 3,000 students taking PISA tests in reading, maths and science. Half the students took the tests on paper and half on screen. The paper-based group did 20 scaled score points better than the computer-based group, about 6 months of additional schooling. Mark West's book, For UNESCO and EdTech Tragedy, charts the consequences of the move to screen-reliant education during COVID. The chapter headings are pretty helpful here. Diminished engagement, reduced achievement, digital addiction, increases in dropout, curtailed conversation, less inclusion, private sector capture of education, supercharged inequalities, new forms of pervasive surveillance, and many more. The upshot of this brilliant book is that the move away from books to screens was an unintentional disaster for children, and that one-to-one devices for education should be phased out. As someone who believes in education as the ultimate social mobility tool, it's very painful to me that the least fortunate children in our society are the least well served by distracting, flimsy digital learning. The evidence that handwriting is more effective for learning than typing has been clinically proven in so many studies now. It increases information retention, retrieval, and memory storage by engaging more brain activity. And since handwriting is slower and more deliberate, students must actively engage with the material. Handwriting is also personal. Arial and Times New Roman are typefaces available to everyone, but a child's own handwriting is a unique font exclusive to him or her, thus creating a relationship between the child and the material being learned. Writing well is a crucial life skill most of us in this room probably take for granted. As Orwell said, if people cannot write well, they cannot think well, and if they cannot think well, then others will do their thinking for them. I'm not going so far as to say this is all part of the big plan, but an education system which chooses to teach students in an inferior way must be ruthlessly analysed and questioned. Most popular digital platforms have shown no improvement in children's entertainment. Many have shown downturns. A comprehensive study on the hugely successful app Mathletics showed the students who didn't use it did better than those who did. So what are we doing? The best performing education systems in the world, namely those in East Asia, use tech with immaculate caution and specificity. Countries like Sweden and Finland are rolling back classroom tech use and reverting to books, pen and paper. I've only got one more second, don't panic. And finally, there's the privacy issue. The same persuasive design elements which make social media and video games so addictive are also used in ed tech because their business models are the same. They both depend on time on device, whether that's an adult on Instagram or a child on a learning platform. Ed tech, like big tech, relies on data. And if these products are being used in schools, that data belongs to children. Yet Internet Safety Labs found that 96% of EdTech platforms sell children's data to third parties. We were sold a dream that technology would revolutionise education, personalise learning and prepare kids for a digital future. Billions of dollars and pounds later, where are we? Test scores are plummeting globally. The increased screen use is damaging children's health. Pupils are resorting to chat GPT to write their essays, and teachers are employing AI to mark them. Which begs the question, what soon will be the point of school? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to all of our fantastic panel. I think one thing that really came through to me is to pick out a phrase that Sophie used, which is that it is a many-headed hydra. And actually there are many types of potential harms. There are also many things where there may be benefits as well. And we all do have phones, but because there are so many different harms, the extreme harms, the extreme content, the use of things, concerns about data, concerns about free speech, that actually there isn't a single silver bullet to address this. As a society, our society is changing rapidly because of this, and it's why I'm so pleased we have such a diverse panel here from different walks of life who have been thinking about different elements of it. We're going to move into Q&A now. We'll be taking questions from the audience and also from online, where I believe we have over 100 people who have dialed in. I will take 2 or 3 questions at once, and rules are no question too outrageous, but if you could please, when I call upon you, if you could just say your name and the organisation you are from. And also if we could keep questions short so that they are questions, not comments. Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that. Jennifer Powers from the Unplugged Coalition. I welcome what many of you said about the importance of focusing on the device, because it is the gateway to all the content, and there's no way the internet can ever be made safe. And with that focus on the device, we've had this huge grassroots movement happening in the UK, I think for that very reason. Talking about schools, one of the things that the Policy Exchange report Disconnected showed is that the policies on paper weren't necessarily worth what they were printed on. Does the panel think that having a rating system for schools' smartphone policy would be something positive to bring greater visibility to for parents and put positive pressure on schools to go further? And I asked this very self-interestedly, as I'm working on just such a scheme to launch in 2 months. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go online next. We've got Damian Towell from Ofsted here. So just bear with us a moment, Damian. Okay, Damian, we'll come back to you soon. The lady in the front.
Hi, I'm Patricia Figueiredo. I'm a reporter covering tech regulation for MLEX. So as you imagine, I'm covering the Online Safety Act very closely. I'm also covering the data bill, and I just noticed that there are new amendments to the data bill that suggest that the age of consent for children to consent to their data being processed by companies would be raised from 13 to 16. And I do understand that this is a policy that right now might not be very well enforced, because we know that children under 13 are using Instagram, even though they're technically not able to consent to their data being processed. So I wonder if you believe raising the age to 16 would have an effective impact, or do you think that Online Safety Act would be the best tool to actually address that kind of thing?
Thank you. I'll take one more question from the room. The gentleman just there.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm from Stonehaven. So we did some research looking at the kind of swing voters that swung the last election, so the people who switched from Tory to Labour. And they're very kind of there's kind of 6 different kind of voter groups within there. They don't really agree on almost anything. The only policy they do agree on is a smartphone ban for under 16s. Based on that, why do you think this government is so kind of dead set against it when that's the only policy a lot of their swing voters actually like and unites them?
Brilliant. That's 3 very different questions. I'll turn to the panel and we'll go in reverse order from speaking. Feel free to address one or more of the questions as you wish. Sophie.
Where shall I go to first? Jennifer, go for it. Good idea. And do the same thing for ed tech. I know so many parents who are really desperate for a school which honours books rather than screens, and about 2 exist. So, yeah, go for it across all the screen issues. I think parents will be very, very interested. Great question from you as well. God knows. Is there some kind of financial incentive? I'm not allowed to say things like that. I don't know why you would not get rid of smartphones from children's lives. I do not understand it. Maybe Rosie knows our dear leader a little well.
Maybe.
Salma, if I could come to you next, I wonder if you could particularly address the comment about
Yes.
digital
So,
consent.
first of all, to say, love MLEX, subscriber, very good content that you produce. I haven't looked at the amendments on the data bill, so I'm just going to give you sort of general principles. I think one of the issues around age verification would suggest that actually you probably need to age gate a bit higher anyway, because of the way that you can potentially get around recognition technologies. And so that's something that I imagine Ofcom might need to look at in a few years' time. I think that if you think about that in relation to data, being able to understand and process what the use of your data actually means, if it sits with the individual user, it would make sense for that to go up in terms of age as well. But the question really is how they sort of correlate and correspond with one another. And I'm afraid that's just legislation, and whether anybody's actually considered how these two things interact, or whether there's a working group in Ofcom at the moment that's looking at that, because obviously there's a different body that's looking at data and data propriety and data usage in the ICO. And one would hope that those two organisations have had this question or provided advice to ministers as to how this can impact on the legislation. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, I don't know, but that's possibly why it's happened in this way, not intentionally. But I would hope there'd be some working group behind it. Do you want me to go to the other ones?
If you'd like to, yes.
Well, just on the banned smartphone question, I think it's, yeah, there are lots of things that voters would want. You know, there'll be lots of things around immigration that voters will want. There'll be lots of things around taxes that voters would want. It's not necessarily right that any of those are brought in. I think there's got to be the balance around it. And I would also say that, to my point around legislation, we have a great example here of someone who's really been successful around smartphone usage in schools. I would rather see that happening rather than legislation which could then be flouted because actually behaviours don't change underneath, and the question really is about impact. I agree that smartphones for under 16s cause untold damage, not just, as I said, the extreme cases, but for those people who are suffering anxiety or mental health issues. But my question is, how do we actually make that, how do we get the outcome that we want? Is it going to be through legislation, or is it through different behaviour and different practices?
Thank you. Damian.
So I think building on that very same point, I think you will find in any movement you have examples of schools that are able to implement phone bans and policies. This is a societal issue. This isn't just an issue in a few small areas, and to address something that is so complex and so difficult, we need a collective response to it. And to get that collective response, I think we do need governmental support to help create those social norms. And in the case of smartphones and social media for under 16s, I think it's an open door. It's a really easy one. Mm-hmm. In terms of should schools have a rating system, I think that parents would, agreeing with Sophie, parents would love to know schools' policies on smartphones and where schools stand. I don't know of a rating system, would I want to be graded as outstanding in this or just, we have Ofsted, we have ways that schools already kind of can be rated. I think, and I know that the parent kind in the consultation to Ofsted are pushing back saying this is something that Ofsted could look at. The head of Ofsted has spoken out. He said, ban them. He is pro for this. So let's see the role that Ofsted can play in ensuring that policies are effective. And I think getting schools to work together in networks and partnerships, perhaps rather than kind of rating what you're doing in that partnership, might be a more effective way of taking this debate forward.
Thank you, Damian. And Rosie, and I'd particularly like you to ask you to address the question of the one around, political barriers, but you alluded to it in your opening speech.
I think it's really interesting about the Jack from Stonehaven saying about people who vote for all parties being united on this. I mean, that's the kind of thing that as a constituency MP you do pick up on, because people don't come and see you if they just voted for you because you were a Labour MP. You know, you will hear people talk about all these issues, and that's how we know those are the topics and subjects we need to talk about in Parliament. So it's often, you know, you get people who are in a position where, through no fault of their own, they're a cabinet secretary or something, and their entire world, really, their whole world of work is here. You lose touch with what people are just talking about in cafes or in your constituency, and this has been bubbling up for quite a while now. And, you know, when people are talking about an issue, it's our job to then look at, well, how can we marry that with legislation? And we're just at that stage now, because everything is happening online and it happens so fast. We're reacting to things. We need to take a lead on it. We need to be able to anticipate. You know, things like signing up to the consent. I remember teaching, I was a teaching assistant in early years 10 years ago. Children were signing those boxes. You just tick the terms and conditions. And if they couldn't do it, their parents were helping them. And they weren't doing it because they were being mean. They wanted their kids. They were like 9 and 10, some of their older brothers. And then the 4 and 5-year-olds I taught wanted to be online. They were signing up for Facebook accounts, and it's so impossible to regulate that. And then people would tell us as teachers, and we would then tell the head to remind parents it wasn't a great idea. But, you know, it's really difficult to kind of regulate that without, again, sounding like a nanny state. So there is that cultural change is so important, isn't it? And I have no idea how we sort of get that. But in Parliament, I feel like we do have a responsibility to literally save lives in some cases, and to listen to those parents who are telling us that's what they want, if only that had been there. And therefore, it might have affected, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? Cultural change or political change and legislation. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think we have to do our bit of the job in Parliament.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more round of questions. There's a lady in blue there, and we'll take first.
Thank you. Julie Dawson, I'm the co-chair of the Age Verification Providers Association and Chief Regulatory and Policy Officer at YOTI. I wondered if members of the panel would support a continuation of the work that Australia has kicked off this year, which will be a one-off review of 50 or so approaches for age assurance, not just at 18, but at other ages. That could be 5, 10, 13, 18. And for that to be done rigorously, including, as Salma was referring to, elements around circumvention, and for that to be done with methods which rely on verification, estimation, and inference, so the full gamut. Do you think that would be something that would be useful?
Thank you. I think there was someone, yes, the lady in white just there.
Thank you. Jojo Penn, I'm a member of the House of Lords. I'm particularly interested in screen use amongst preschoolers, and I'd be really interested in the panel's perspective on what policy response there could be to support improvements or changes in social norms around screen use with younger children. And we also have the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill with the House of Lords at the moment, and I completely appreciate that legislation isn't the answer to everything, and we will have a debate in the Lords about banning phones in schools. But is there anything else we should be thinking about when it comes to that bill and some of the issues discussed today that you think should be raised? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And one final question, lady just there.
Hi, Julie Redmond. I'm one of the chairs for CWO and NW8 Mums, Marylebone Mums, and I chair other mothers groups in London. Everything the panel have actually spoken about today really is incredibly important for the future of our children. What we're seeing in children from 6 to 10 is unbelievable. Every day I have messages on the WhatsApp groups continuously from mothers really, really worried and concerned. I have a 10-year-old myself, and I'm incredibly concerned for his future in the next 6 years of his life. So for me, listening to your thoughts and your vision for a school with a ban, a complete ban on phones, I think is the way forward. This is not going to happen all at the same time. As you said, you've been working on it since 2017. So I think it has to be one stage at a time, but I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. At the moment, all of the mothers in Westminster and North London are coming together and actually forming a huge group on this. It's become too important to ignore. Thank you.
You very much. Rosie, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, thanks. I just want to talk about schools technology. I should sort of confess that when I was teaching 4 and 5-year-olds, we had, I can't remember which year it was, gosh, but Tim Peake was in space. And we had a thing where the whole school could come together and then individual classes, and it was kind of age tweets. And it was a really clever thing where he'd done a pre-record and we pretended it was live. We pretended that the kids were interacting with Tim Peake. It was so fab to get them talking about space and to get them into that. So technology played a really brilliant part there. But it was a kind of, it was a sort of platform for discussing things and talking about and learning about our project. Yeah, we were all together. It wasn't people in their own homes or their own bedrooms or their own. So I think there is, you know, I also used to teach kids on a thing called Speech and Language Link, because we just didn't have the money for speech and language teachers or therapists, and that's an awful, so it's all kind of connected. And I'd love to know more about the age verification body and the board and how we can help in Parliament sort of maybe make that part of the children's bill or something, because I don't know enough about it at all. You sound like an absolute expert. That'd be really great to know about. And what was the other one? Yeah, I think it's just a question of we need to start having these conversations, but properly and in depth, because so many issues in Parliament, and then the Lords actually probably sometimes get a bit longer and have more in-depth discussions. But the truth is, and this sounds awful, but a lot of what we do in Parliament, in the Commons, is for social media likes. And I know I have a big presence on social media, but for clips and for sort of a quick, cheap kind of solution or reaction, I think we need to really have these deep conversations involved with the Lords as well, because sometimes we don't have that connection, do we? We do a thing, you guys try and fix it, actually it'd be better to work together on something like this. So I'd love a conversation with you, Jojo.
Thank you.
I think building on what you just said, Rosie, it's very different to give a child technology and expect them to kind of navigate it themselves than to learn alongside the child. And I think there's a very real difference between what some of this technology might have been designed for and how it's been implemented. That said, I think focusing on the early years is huge. And we've been doing some work recently with our teachers where we asked them, you know, how much time do you leave your screen on for? And the vast majority of teachers will go in at the beginning of the day, you put your screen on, and that screen will be on for the whole day. And even something like telling a story, where, you know, facial expression, the child's curiosity and imagination is being lost because the screen's there with a picture and children are passively watching the picture as opposed to engaging in the story and learning to develop their own curiosity and their imagination. So I do think there's a huge amount of work to do in the early years around screen use. And I think that there hasn't been an intent by teachers to put screens into early years. It's something that has just happened in time. Teachers come in at the beginning of the day, they turn the screens on and leave them on and don't think. It's not a conscious decision. And I think what we've done in our school is we've now asked teachers as part of planning to make a conscious decision. Do you need a screen to deliver this content? And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. Does that need to take place? Especially for children of such a young age. And I'd go so far as to say that within nurseries, is there a place for screens within nurseries? And I think the answer is not. I think you can deliver content, you can deliver learning, you can encourage more real-world engagement without the use of those screens in our nurseries around the school. I think the age verification is really important. I think that for all of these things to be enforceable, we're going to need to have really effective ways of doing it. I would, from a school's point of view, I think taking the devices out of children's hands in the first place is perhaps the best way of doing this. But then when we need to enforce things, we're going to need systems to do it. So that sounds really exciting what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Salma.
So first on the age verification point, yes, absolutely. I think one of the challenges right way back, in fact, it was in 2014 that the first bit of attempted legislation around age verification for online pornography was where we sort of first started having this discussion in public policy. And the biggest challenge that came was that no age verification technology exists, right? So, you know, we can't possibly stop people from looking at hardcore pornography under the age of 18 because, gosh, there's no way of stopping them from being able to search it. So this is absolutely critical. I think that any industry-led bodies that can come together to try and look at that innovation, test what is possible, keep pushing itself to make that as good as it can be, should be welcomed. And I would love to follow the work because I think it's a really important part of this debate. Just to Jojo's question, Jojo and I are former colleagues, and in fact, Jojo, I should give you a shout out here. Jojo was in number 10 when I was in the Home Office starting this work, and you were incredibly supportive, and I don't think it could have gotten as far as it did even before we all left government if Theresa hadn't supported it at the time, so I thank you for that. I don't have a proper answer to your question, I'm afraid, but I can tell you from my own personal experience, for preschoolers, of which I have one, the worst thing is how much time I spend on my phone. And that's what he learns. My daughter, who's slightly older, is even worse because I worked in government at the time and all I did was stare at a phone. And so the reason I'm mentioning that is that this talk is entitled, you know, about what governments and parents can do in the future, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the cultural norm that I've established in the house is the wrong one, and I need to take account for that, and I need to take responsibility for that. That at some point I put my phone down so that my kids don't think that the whole world and some magical thing happens in this little device, but that is on me.
As a parent, I very much empathise with that point there. And,
yeah,
Sophie.
I agree with that. I agree with that 90%. I also think grown-ups and children are different, and there just has to be different rules, and we can sort of do things that they can't. I know it's bad to be on our phones. But
yeah, but that's what I mean. Like, you know, I need my phone to live.
Yeah.
But what I mean is that, you know, when I'm with the children, they can't see. It's like you said, you know, parents looking at their phones when their kids are rushing out.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah, I agree. I can't add to that apart from echo Damian's words that maybe we don't need screens in early years. I think that would be huge.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, thank you to our audience for some brilliant questions there. I think if I just sort of close, one of the things which really resonated with me today, it's about last month I was in a round table which Jonathan Haidt had joined online, and one of the things he said there was that in these sorts of issues you can't have legislation march too far ahead of culture. In order to achieve change, you need legislation and you need cultural change, and that they are both partners. You can't, one trying to make all the running without the other won't work, and I think that has come through from the discussion here. It's not a case of either or, it's a case of both, and but as Rosie said, in the domains which we're all in, we all have to do our bit. And I'd like to say thank you to our panel today for doing their bit so spectacularly, and thank you very much for coming to Policy Exchange and letting us have this fantastic event.